Hey, this is Tim again. This week, I'm going to talk to you about how to sell your home with a tenant in it. There's a few options. It's a little bit complicated in some areas, but we'll get to the base of it and give you a guideline of what to do. Disclaimer, I am not a paralegal and I am not a lawyer. All the information can be found on the landlord tenant board. This is specifically to Ontario, but the strategy can be used throughout depending on what you're actually using itself. So if you have a home and you are selling it and you have a tenant in it, there's a few ways to go around it. The simplest way is if a buyer is planning to assume the tenant and they are an investor, they can automatically assume the lease and it just continues. That's the simplest way, obviously. But sometimes when a tenant is in there, their rents might be low or the purchaser might want to move in. So there are a few options to get a tenant out of the place properly and legally. And I'll discuss different forms to use depending on the situation and which one would be best and how to go around it. The big thing of doing this with the tenants is communication, actually. So you want to communicate with the tenant as well as with the landlord, if that being yourself or the property manager, and how to discuss this and making sure that the tenant understands their rules and their rights, as well as what is the whole process behind them actually being there while it's being sold. So the first form is if the tenant has been in there, and it doesn't really matter kind of what length it is a mutual release form. And this is the N11. So this is where the landlord and the tenant agree to a move out date. And this date could be within 10 days, it could be within 3 to 4 months. So this is an agreeable date that both the landlord and the tenant agree that the tenant will move out. No extra compensation is needed, but there can be compensation as well. So that's going to be another point to discuss with the tenant. The next form is the N12. And this form is when a family member of the landlord or the purchaser, so they define this as a parent, the actual person, the landlord that's moving in, a spouse. I'm just reading my notes here so I remember a child or the spouse's parents. So if it's in one of those, they can move into the unit. The notice has to be within 60, at least minimum of 60 days at the end of the term. So for example, if they're paying March rent and their term ends rent on the 1st of March, the 60 days has to be at the end of the month. There is also a 1 month compensation to be given to the tenant by the termination date. So this is if you're selling the place and the buyer, for example, is planning to move in. A lot of times this will happen for single family homes, not as much as duplexes or multifamilies, obviously, but it does still happen where, say, for example, a buyer is planning to move into the home and they want both units for an extended family, for example. So this is a form that you give when you are actually, the buyer is actually planning to move in, or you yourself as a landlord is planning to move in as well. The third form, and this is probably the trickiest one, is the N13, is where you're giving the tenant notice to vacate because of extensive renovations. And this has been in the news quite a bit recently. So this one has to be done very carefully. And the renovations are extensive that you do need a permit, or things that you might be and you need the tenant out. So for example, if you're shutting off the water, you're shutting off the hydro for multiple days and the tenant can't actually be there. So this one is going to be a little bit trickier, and they have the right to move back in after the renovations are done. But in combination of the other forms, you can let them know that you are planning to sell it after these renovations are done, and you can add an 11 mutual release with that, or give them the idea that something that if a purchaser does buy the property and they are moving in, they're going to be planning to move out anyways. So with the N13, you do have to list all the work that's needed, and it has to be a minimum of 120-day notice as well. And there is also a 1 month compensation. all the notes for these forms and the details can be found on the landlord tenant board. I believe it's tribunalsontario.ca, but double check that link. We'll have that link probably in the show notes as well. But these forms have to be given properly to the tenants in there. So with the renovations, the biggest thing is that you're actually doing the renovations, and even for the N12 is that you actually are having a family member move in or the purchaser's family member move in. The biggest thing that the tenants complain about is that you aren't doing these faithfully. So if you are giving these forms out, do it in a faithful manner. Make sure that you're doing the right form. The N11 might be the easiest, and how you explain it and when going through the whole process. And this is the best for the single family ones, because the majority of people that are buying a single family home are going to be owner occupied. So what will happen, and I'm going through this process right now with multiple tenants at the same time, is that if we put the home on the market and we do find a buyer, it may be an investor, it may be an owner occupied. We don't know yet until we actually get that offer. So the options is that you can risk it. And this is how you're going to explain it to the tenant, is that you can risk it that if it is an investor, they're going to assume you as a tenant and the lease continues as is. You just pay month rent going forward to that new landlord. However, if it is a owner occupied purchaser, we'll give you 60-day notice and you get 1 month's compensation. And that's going to be the rule, and we're following the landlord tenant board. However, if we sign a mutual release beforehand, at least you can tell me the day that you want to move out, and it gives you less pressure and less stress finding a place. So for example, if you want to move out at the end of May, at the end of June, for example, and this might be 60, 90, 120 days out, you let me know that there's going to be no penalty to break the lease, and there's no going to be any extra fees or anything with this as well. We mutually agree upon you leaving this date on this date, and at least you know when you have to move out, and it's not rushed for you within a 60-day period. If you find a place sooner, what happens is that we can adjust that N11 and move it closer, and you can move out earlier, but your last date is your end date. So the big thing with dealing with a sale of a property, or even just having the discussion with the tenant, is the communication part. So when you're communicating with the tenant, that's the biggest thing. You're not kicking them out for unlawful reasons, and you're not being unethical about it. Be a good landlord and help the tenant find a place if needed as well. It's just, the big thing is, again, communication. If you communicate with the tenant, most things will go smoothly. There's probably going to be quite a bit of questions on this, so you can reach out to our team. If you do like this information, hit the subscribe and like button, and we'll see you in another week or so.